Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Elaine Kub analyzes corn and soybean market movement during a torturously hot week. Bob Klein talks about soybean nodulation. Greg Kruger discusses how row spacing in soybeans could affect yield. And Matt Stockton weighs the efficiency of small cows versus large cows. Elaine Kub is our marketing analyst this week. The latest crop conditions report showed this year's corn and soybeans were holding pace and still far better than 2012's. But those ratings were for the week ending Sunday, August 25th. And one would guess the week ending September 1st will be rough on the scoring system. Iowa is already in tough shape. Along with North Dakota, it has the highest percentage of soybeans in poor or very poor shape, and only Kansas has less corn rated as good or excellent. I naively suggested a couple of weeks ago an early frost might be the unusual weather rally for corn and beans. That was obviously wrong. Even if temperatures back off now, a strong close to last week's markets and a monster Monday have brought back the bulls. We talked with Elaine Wednesday afternoon about floors and ceilings for 2013 and how corn and soybeans were weathering this week.
Well, this week has definitely been marked by some liquidation, which we would expect to see because we've got a 3-day holiday weekend coming up and it's the end of the month. So it's natural, and particularly after the big move we've had, beans have moved up more than $1 just in the past week, more than $2.50 over the past month. So it certainly makes sense for the funds and the speculators, for instance, especially to be pulling out of this, taking out some of their profits. But I think that whatever downward movement or this sort of pause that we're experiencing this week, the underlying factor is still very bullish when you consider the weather that's going on out in the country and just the overall production picture.
How far can that carry if it, that obviously the start of a weather rally on Monday or maybe the finish based off of what happened last week as well, but how could that continue again?
That's a really good question, whether it's all priced in already or whether there will be more to see. And I'm in the camp that there is more to be seen because I think that we are having bushels being lost right now as we speak. I think that the damage that's being done by the hot and dry weather this week throughout the core of the Corn Belt, not just in the droughty areas here in the western Corn Belt, but even in the central and eastern Corn Belt, there are cornfields firing, like I said, as we speak.
Yeah.
And I think over the holiday weekend, people will take another stock of this and perhaps realize the damage that's being done because the crop is so late.
From what you hear or from what you read, what's your impression of how the crop looks, corn and beans, as it goes from Nebraska, South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, kind of those states?
Well, Nebraska, has a lot of irrigated acres, so that has certainly helped some of them, but the dryland acres are sort of hit and miss. But the thing to keep in mind about the irrigated acres is all the money that has been spent on irrigation this year means that the cost of production has therefore gone up. And you're looking at December futures prices that do not necessarily reimburse a farmer for their cost of production right now, particularly in irrigated Nebraska. So that makes selling very difficult. And as you go farther east, it again is sort of hit and miss. There's portions of Iowa that are very scrubby. There's portions of Illinois that are really starting to look crispy, like I said, really firing, and you really wonder about how the bean fields are going to hold up in the hot and dry weather, aborted bean fields. And Ohio, when you go very far east, has been like the one last portion of the Corn Belt that has had some really great crops. But even the Pro Farmer Crop Tour a couple weeks ago, didn't find anything really overwhelming there. So there's nothing overwhelming, and we're getting all kinds of estimates now bringing the production numbers back down.
Yeah, it was kind of a tempered tour. They kind of took the legs out from Ohio because Ohio had so much, hoopla to it after the last USDA report. But how wide is the distance between the floor and the ceiling for the new crop?
I think for corn, the floor is pretty well established here. I think that from a demand perspective, we've certainly got room for the ethanol industry to keep on demanding it. So I think, you know, there's certainly a floor there. And like I mentioned, the cost of production, we're already below it in many cases. The ceiling, I don't know, it depends on exactly how bad things are getting burned up this week especially. There might be a little more room for it to come up. For soybeans, I think the range is just wild. Like we've made it above the $14 mark. $14.09 3/4 was the contract high for the November soybeans from last September, and we have not quite made it through there yet. But once you go through that, who knows where the ceiling is? There's just a wide window. For soybeans have been kind of stable these last couple of days, and this is on Wednesday, and God knows, you know, it could go 40, 50 cents on any given day anymore.
And a freeze scare could do wonders too.
Oh wow, yeah, a freeze scare if it came very early would also affect corn, I believe, because everything is so late. You would expect at the end of August, you're no longer really having these weather markets. You would expect the grain to pretty much be made and be seeing the soybeans turning already, but that's not what we're seeing this year. This is basically like a weather market in early August because of how late we are.
How do you expect basis to move as we go towards harvest?
I think that is also a weather market, which is unusual for this time of year. We're seeing some large crops coming out of the south, and they're having trouble finding truck freight and just sort of the usual harvest experiences you have. So you will see that, and you will see pressure on basis in the very near term as harvest, the gut slot goes through. But I think once we get past harvest, if we don't have as much grain as these buyers are expecting to see, I think there is certainly potential for another spring rally in basis.
For a farmer or rancher, how important is Syria right now? Obviously, global stocks are keeping a close eye on it. Oil is getting to, you know, points it hasn't been in a few months here. How important do you think it is for a person on the farm?
Yeah, oil, the dollar, gold, everything has also been going crazy this week, just sort of macroeconomic stories that grains don't necessarily follow, but it is important for farmers to follow because they're going to be looking at fuel costs for their harvesting. And I don't think that there's any really good news for retail fuel buyers in the next weeks or months as we go through this geopolitical risk. I think that we're looking at a bullish story just because of the risk and the risk aversion in the crude oil markets.
Next week, we'll look at how recent heat and the coming harvest are affecting feedlot margins with Mike Briggs. A large reason Nebraska leads the nation in irrigated crop acres is because of the large source of water located beneath it. Under 8 states, the High Plains Aquifer helps support life for plants and livestock above it. But Kansas State University said this week irrigation trends need to change or the state of Kansas will deplete 69% of its groundwater in 50 years. If Kansas altered its water use habits, though, it could extend the supply of the High Plains Aquifer and increase agricultural production there through 2110. The study estimates 3% of the aquifer's water had been used in Kansas by 1960, another 30% by 2010, and an additional 39% will be used by 2060. It says once the aquifer is depleted, it could take 500 to 1,300 years to completely refill itself. At this time last year, almost a quarter of Nebraska's soybeans were turning color. While late planting and a cooler summer have slowed progress, the condition of this year's beans is far superior to 2012. 2013 beans are 51 percentage points better in the good or excellent categories compared to late August last year. At this time in the growing season and even throughout, growers can be observing their soybean plants to see how they're using nitrogen from the soil. While we may normally talk about applying and using N for corn, Bob Klein says beans may need more than you think.
They use a lot of nitrogen. It's unbelievable how much they use. And an average soybean yield will take up 315 pounds of nitrogen. About 60% of that goes into the seed, which is about 190 pounds, and then the other 40%, or about 125 pounds, goes in the stover. So the soybean plant has to have a lot of nitrogen available, and we get this produced by the nodules on the roots and so forth. If we don't have those nodules, we can have quite nitrogen deficiency in our soybeans.
Describe to me how important it is throughout the season and at this point to check out those nodules and see what they look like.
Yeah, and we want to do this fairly early in the season because we do sometimes rescue them by putting on additional nitrogen. Put on nitrogen real early does not help, but put on flowering to the pod fill stage has helped somewhat, not near as much as good inoculation. We've seen yield increases from about 24 to 32% by applying 50 to 100 pounds of nitrogen later in the season. That's flowering to the pod fill stage. We're running some tests on that. I know Michigan found out where soybeans were well inoculated as compared to, they weren't inoculated well. There was a 45% difference in yield. Now, we would expect a bigger difference in yield in Nebraska than here because they got a lot more higher organic matter in Michigan in most areas than we have in Nebraska, and therefore they get more mineralization from the organic matter, which helps the soybeans.
And even from the field sometimes, Bob, you can kind of tell the difference between what fields had some N in there and which didn't?
Yeah, you can really tell that now on a couple of pictures that we have here. Inoculant was mixed with the seed, but in this particular case, some of the seed did not get inoculated well, and so you could see right to the row of the planter. On one of the samples there's no nodules on it. On the other one, the soybeans, and it's just moving over to another set of rows, are well nodulated. And you can really see that in the field. This was a 12-row planter that was used, and you can just see those 12 rows sticking out there, the ones that are well nodulated and the ones that don't have any nodules on. So there's some big differences, and I'm sure there'll be some big differences in yields.
Okay, if you were going to go out to the field and dig a plant up, what's the process you need to do to look at that nodule and cut through it?
Yeah, you want to take a good spade out there. Just don't pull up the soybeans because you'll knock off a lot of the nodules in the process. So dig them up with a spade and then either wash the soil off or shake it off. It depends how much it's sticking with soil moisture content. And then check for the nodules, and you'll see, like in this picture, if you got real good nodules, there'll be a lot of them. And in some pictures here as we see them, part of the plants we have there, the three that are well nodulated. There's a lot of nodules on there. And it's surprising how many people are bringing in soybean samples for us to look at and that are not doing well. And in most of those cases, they have very few nodules on. And so those fields would benefit from some applications of nitrogen, but that's expensive. And then it's almost getting too late for much of it this year.
Bob has a Crop Watch article forthcoming on nodulation and the use of inoculants in soybeans. We'll link to that on the Market Journal homepage. Hot temperatures last summer helped keep soybean aphids at bay. The readings close to 100 degrees these past few days have been atypical from what most of Nebraska has seen in June, July, and August of 2013. But even with cooler than normal weather, UNL Extension educator Wayne Ohnesorg says aphids have been minimal.
This summer they've been really low. Generally speaking, we're seeing, if you have a field that's got a high population, about 5 aphids per plant average, and you got to really search for them throughout the field. And it's kind of continued that way up until now. Aphids don't do well in 95+ degree heat, and last year would have kept populations really low. So those overwintering were most likely low as well. So we're just waiting for things to rebound. The back off of the heat is going to be a concern for the producers to be scouting their fields still. And as far as timing of scouting, we're still in R5 up in the northern part of the state. That seed is still filling and expanding. Once we get to R6, where that seed is fully expanded and still green, that's where you really can back off on your threshold. Up until that point, we use the 250 aphids per plant threshold. Best suggestive guess at this point for R6 is more like 750 to 1,000 aphids per plant, which we likely may not see.
We'll see if any cool down is in store towards the end of the show when Al gives his weekly weather forecast. Soybean row spacing can affect yield. At least that's what research indicated at a recent soybean management field day. Over the last 3 years, trials with row spacing components have shown there is a different result from planting 30 and 15-inch as well as drilled rows of beans. But moving gaps between rows can also open up disease pressures. We recently talked with Greg Kruger about the research in a state featuring farmers utilizing all three options.
Well, every year we've had a little bit different study, but we've had row spacing components in studies for the last 3 years now. So,
what's your impression as you kind of go around the state of how many farmers are using a 30-inch row spacing, a 15, and then maybe drilling it in?
Well, between the 15s and 30s, we're probably about half and half, and we've got just a few guys that are still drilling beans in, but that's a pretty small percentage, Jeff.
So what's the reason for looking at row spacing? Why do you think there might be an advantage to switching between any of the three?
Well, certainly we know that plants develop yield through photosynthesis, and so the more sunlight we can capture, the greater that photosynthetic rate is. So our hypothesis when we started, based on past research and stuff that's going on in other states, is that with the narrower rows we can capture sunlight at a greater efficiency because we're going to canopy over earlier in the season.
And what does it look like? What kind of results are you getting in a cool year like this, mind you?
Well, certainly our hypotheses were right, that we're seeing the narrow row spacing certainly pay off in the long run. We're seeing somewhere between 5 and 10% yield increases in most cases. And you know, certainly the farther north we get, Nebraska being pretty north in the Corn Belt, we're going to have a higher advantage, or more advantage to those narrow row spacings because our growing season's a little bit shorter. A year like this, where it's been a cool year, late planting, those narrow row spacings are going to play even a greater role in yield.
You mentioned today that there was some research at Illinois that said there's a difference in diseases once you start to switch around row spacings. Explain that.
Yeah, so when we talk about yield advantages, that's assuming that we've got a perfect growing environment like we have at most of these soybean management field day sites, where we have full irrigation, limited disease and insect pressure and things like that, good weed control. In a situation where we may have disease pressure or something like that, that wider row spacing may actually play an advantage. For example, if we've got white mold problems, that wider row spacing seems to be very advantageous because we get more airflow through the canopy, and we're seeing lower disease incidence rates in those types of situations.
How does it relate? We talked to you last year at the Soybean Management Field Day about plant population. How does it relate to, I mean, obviously this is a canopy situation, but just in terms of total growth?
Yeah, so certainly the higher the plant population, the quicker we're going to get canopy. We do see a little bit of a yield increase from bumping those populations up, but we got to be real careful that we don't get plant populations so high that we induce lodging at the end of the season. It can make it really tough for our growers to try to pick that soybean up off the ground if it's severely lodged. In terms of plant population itself, we really didn't see a huge effect on yields, pretty modest in most cases, as long as we were over about 75 or 80,000 plants per acre. When we look at the economic sweet spot, we're probably wanting to get those growers in that 125 to 150,000 plants per acre. So they're probably going to need to see just a little bit higher than that at the beginning of the year.
What should a farmer weigh if he or she is thinking about making a difference in row spacing? And I'm sure there are some equipment things that play into that.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing, and that's probably why we see some diversity in who's in 30-inch rows and 15-inch rows. Is a lot of guys are going to plant what they've got the equipment for. So if you don't have the equipment for a 15-inch row, it makes it tough to switch over. If we were to make a recommendation to our growers, I'd say if you're going to go buy a new planter, look at buying a 15-inch row planter, but I wouldn't jump out and go buy a planter just for that unless I was running thousands and thousands of acres, because what you're going to pay for is going to have a slower turnaround period, just because it is, even though a 5% yield increase is significant, it's not going to pay for a $250,000 piece of equipment overnight.
Obviously, 2013 test plots can't be fully judged until harvest, so UNL educators will share yield data from these trials at crop production clinics this winter. It'll be hard to miss the September Nebraska Farmer when it arrives in your mailbox. It has more than 250 pages and includes the Husker Harvest Days show program. Everything you need to know about the 2013 show west of Grand Island is contained in this month's issue, including special events, field demonstrations, and locations of the 600 exhibitors. The Nebraska Farmer's September magazine is the largest of the year and also features in-depth articles about crop and livestock production, natural resource issues, and marketing information. This year's Husker Harvest Days takes place September 10th through the 12th. You can find Market Journal there at booth number 321 on 3rd Street. UNL researchers recently released a study detailing the case between smaller and larger cows. At the Goodmanson Sandhills Lab open house last week, Matt Stockton told us why the results showed it was important for each producer to determine what they wanted out of their animals.
Well, it's been long debated in the popular literature, where you'll see an article come out and it'll say, hey, small cows are more efficient and all this kind of thing. And then you'll see, you go to another meeting and you'll talk to some of the feedlot guys and they'll say, no, we really want the bigger calves and the big calves. Well, you got to have bigger cows to have bigger calves. And so there seems to be this kind of debate, depending on how you use the calf, what you should have.
You say more efficient in terms of what?
Well, the cow guys usually are talking about biological efficiency. They're talking about the fact that you got a smaller cow and therefore you can produce more pounds of beef per acre and this sort of thing.
What are you looking at, though? What is your research showing?
That's what you're really looking at is, okay, if I have whatever, in other words, costs are, kind of equal, what happens with cow size? How does that affect my profitability? And so what we found is that depending on what you do with the calf and your terminal end, it will determine whether you want a large or small cow, which kind of backs up everything everybody's saying. But now we have some empirical numbers, and it also talks about the fact that, there's a reason that you want a small or large cow. For example, you're out here on the pasture, smaller cows eat less over the year and there's some things, but they produce a good sized calf. But then when you get them in the feedlot, the smaller calves from the smaller cows don't perform as well as perhaps the bigger ones. They do a lot more weight gain for the larger cows in the feedlots.
So it's still a producer's choice maybe as to what he's going to do with the cow?
Right. So in other words, if you know what system you're going to do, in other words, you're going to sell at a certain point, then you're going to want to adapt your cow size to maximize your profitability. And this study actually brings that all out and it tells you why and how this works.
What role does age play in this?
Well, that's another question. See, here's a whole nother thing, because it turns out I didn't know age was going to be affected, because you think of optimal age being about 6 to 8 years old. Well, it turns out, depending on what you're doing with your calf, if you're going to get grid price animals, and they're going to go directly, you're going to take them and you're going to retain them and keep them in the feedlot, you want the oldest cow you can get. For some reason, the calves from those older cows, they grade better, or they're bigger, or there's something about them, the older the cow, the better. Whereas if you want to do something else with it, you're going to want it from a younger cow. In fact, if you're going to sell heifers, you want it from a 2 or 3 year old cow. You don't want the older cows. It's kind of interesting. I don't know why that's the case. I'm trying to figure it out. But that seems to be the results of the models that we ran.
So economically, is there a suggestion that you make to producers?
You figure out what it is you're going to use, find the system you're going to use, and then choose your cattle size according to what you're going to have your cattle to, because that's going to maximize your profitability.
Now, after a hot week across Nebraska, here with his latest weather outlook is UNL Extension State climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main brunt of this forecast, let's take a little bit of a look at what's happened during this past week. Well, the big news has been the heat. And we have seen pretty much 2 consecutive weeks now of temperatures well into the 90s for a vast majority of the state, with 100-degree readings. Been fairly common the last few days across portions of the Panhandle and the Southwest. And of course, the lack of precipitation has been a concern. We kind of dragged this out for a good portion of eastern Nebraska for the last month, and it's taken an impact on the crops. We're seeing the crops falling apart rather rapidly, and I suspect that we're going to see some detrimental impacts from this dryness on yields. How bad of a situation it is remains to be determined, because we certainly do have another stretch of hot weather ahead of us before a more significant cooling trend might be in the offings as we get into late next weekend. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we may have in store for us as we progress through this period. And the first thing I'll draw your attention to is the big expansive area of high pressure that's dominated much of the Central Plains over the last 10 to 14 day period is now showing signs of breaking down and pushing toward the west in response to a trough coming out of central and northern Canada. Now this trough will be moving toward the east-southeast, and so it's just going to likely clip eastern Nebraska and leave the vast majority of the very cool temperatures to the east of us, but it does provide us with the opportunity for a little bit of a moisture. Now the surface front with this trough moving in isn't expected to move into our region until after midnight, so the thought is that we will not see any thunderstorm activity, at least in the southern half of the state, until we get well into tomorrow morning. But for the northern part of the state, we might generate a couple scattered thunderstorms as this front pushes through. For those that are going to the game in Lincoln, it does appear that we'll see fairly hot conditions in Lincoln, with game time temperatures somewhere between 89 and 92 degrees, And as we get to the 10 p.m. hour, which should be wrapping up the game, we'll be looking at temperatures that will be in the upper 70s to the low 80s and probably cooling down in the low 60s. And then the thunderstorm chances will roll in, even though they're only about a 10 to 20% chance. Now, as we get into tomorrow, we'll see that the main activity of this upper air trough is going to move the energy to the east of us. So that just leaves us with scattered thunderstorms. And at that in eastern Nebraska, 20 to 30% coverage. Total quantitative precipitation output for this next 5-day period is only looking to be in the quarter to half-inch range. If you do get a thunderstorm, you might get some heavier totals. But overall, not expecting a big washout as we go forward in time. Now, as we get into Monday, with that cool air in place and pushing that ridge back down, we do expect to see some fairly nice conditions in eastern Nebraska, but the temperatures will start to rise in western Nebraska in response to this ridge, once again rebuilding into the region. As we go into Tuesday, we'll see that that ridge builds up even farther, starts to push the warmer air into eastern Nebraska, and then by the time we get into Wednesday, we'll see that that big core of that ridge starts to materialize. The Four Corners region is going to push toward the Central Plains. So by the time we get to Thursday, here it is sitting very well firmly in place, but notice another trough coming in. That's expected to arrive this weekend. So the hot conditions will continue with just a scattered, isolated thunderstorm possible across the western half of the state. And as we get into Friday, here comes that trough, which is expected to push in on Saturday and give us a shot of decent moisture. So in terms of the temperatures, nothing we can say but hot, hot, hot. Just isolated thunderstorm activity Saturday and Sunday, and possibly again on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, particularly in western Nebraska. 8 to 14-day forecast pushes that cooler air to our east. And in terms of precipitation, we do start to see that moisture moving in response to that trough building from the Pacific Northwest.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews with Elaine Kub, Bob Klein, Greg Kruger, and Matt Stockton are available individually on the Market Journal website and through our mobile app as part of the August 30th episode. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our cattle market analyst, and Brad Lubin will update us on public policy issues. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.